Good morning, everyone. Sawadee kap. Salamat pagi. Magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. And my name is Joel Barredo. I am the Program Director of Shape C, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Town Hall session on ASEAN Member States' accountability on human rights during and post-COVID-19. And I hope this session finds you in good health and safety. We are about to enter the 6th month since the first COVID-19 outbreak occurred in Southeast Asia. And it has indeed been a lived experience for everyone. As the number of cases began to increase, militarized approaches to the pandemic also spiked throughout the region. The securitization of COVID-19 in the region shows that it comes with a painful cost. What started with lockdowns, travel bans, border closures, eventually led to police surveillance, detainment, control of access to information, and further shrinking of spaces for dissent and activism. In our beloved region, Southeast Asia, there is a clear evidence that disruptions of public health and other essential services, coupled with highly securitized emergency measures, can create more dangers, especially in contexts where there are insufficient safety nets and legal safeguards. By adapting this wartime rhetoric, states deem necessary to suspend fundamental rights and freedoms to achieve victory in their respective countries. To make matters worse, people are obliged to assume duties and responsibilities sanctioned by the state. And anyone who disobeys and diverts from the agenda would have to pay a hefty price. And unfortunately, these people are the ones who are vulnerable and at the very margins of our society. And this is the very reason why we are conducting this town hall session in light of the virtual ASEAN Summit happening this week. This town hall session seeks to provide a space for dialogue between CSOs and human rights defenders, as well as vulnerable and marginalized groups, to speak and convey to ASEAN members of parliament their concern and demands regarding human rights situation and wider questions concerning the livelihood of people in the region. It shall provide an opportunity for CSOs to also shape the discourse and agenda in light of the current and future condition of human rights and freedoms in Southeast Asia. But first, we would like to hear the voices from our CSOs and also the response from our members of parliament at the national level, as well as representatives from relevant ASEAN bodies at the regional level. I would like first to remind everyone that we have a Q&A box. And if you wish to ask any questions, please do share them at the, on the Q&A box. You may share your name and your affiliation. Otherwise, you can also remain anonymous throughout when asking your question or giving your responses or your comments. And we hope that throughout these 2 to 3 hour town hall session that we'll be able to achieve something on behalf of the peoples of ASEAN. Thank you so much. I would like to first introduce our speakers, and then I would then give the floor to our CSO members who will be giving their voices for this town hall session. First, I would be introducing our CSO members, Rachel Arinii Judhistari, who is the EA ASEAN Program Manager of Forum Asia. We also have Chris Lewa, Deputy Chair of APPRN Rohingya Working Group. We have Sopheap Chak, Executive Director, Cambodia Center on Human Rights. We have Ryan Silverio, Regional Coordinator of the ASEAN SOGIE Caucus. Tolhas Damanik of the Agenda Disability Rights Advisor. Mohammed Shafi, who is the General Secretary of ASETUC. Our members of parliament and representatives of ASEAN bodies include Charles Santiago, who is a member of parliament of Malaysia. We also have Sarah Jane Elago, our member of parliament from the Philippines. We have Yuyun Wahyunigrum, who is the AICHR representative of Indonesia. And as the assistant to the representative of Vietnam to the AICHR, Chow Huang Nguyen, will be joining us as well. So I will now give the floor to Rachel to start the ball rolling and to illuminate the voice of the people on the ground. Rachel,
Thank
the
you.
floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Joel. I would like to take the help from Hanung to present the PowerPoint, please. Thank you. My name is Rachel Arinii with Forum Asia. We are a regional human rights organization. And today I would like to share with you the result of our rapid assessment on the effectiveness of ASEAN response to COVID-19 that we did together with SAPA and also SHAPE-C. So next. Next, please. Next. Hello. Next slide, please. Hanung, next.
Rachel, in my screen it's already next. Can you see it?
No, it's still on the first.
Okay, let me just can you see it now?
Nope.
Cornelius Hanung stop screen share Zoom webinar. Cornelius Hanung started screen share.
Yes, thank you.
Okay,
So the ASEAN countries have reported at least 134,000 COVID-19 cases. However, the ASEAN's Secretary General estimated that the real numbers are likely to be higher than those officially provided. And the figures are continuing to rise, while we also need to be very mindful about the possibilities of second wave. Next, please. And in alignment with that, as I mentioned earlier, there are rapid assessment of CSO's perceptions on the effectiveness of ASEAN response during the COVID-19, which we organized from 12 to 24 June 2020. Next. From the survey, we receive the information from all Southeast Asia countries, ranging from academia, media, international organization, regional organization, and local organization. Even we receive input from grassroots organizations. Next. And the key questions that we asked to the survey respondent are: have ASEAN facilitated meaningful participations of CSOs during the pandemic? And it says that 80% of the respondents disagree with the statement, which means that ASEAN have not facilitated meaningful participation of CSOs during the pandemic. Next. And some of the comments from the survey respondents say that they don't see any engagement between ASEAN officials and the civil society organizations in the previous ASEAN Special Summit on COVID-19, as well as the current summit that will be happening tomorrow. Next. The second key question that we also asked the respondent is whether the ASEAN human rights mechanism have ensured the adoptions and implementation of human rights-based approach in the ASEAN pandemic responses. And starting 75% say that they disagree with the statement, which means that probably ASEAN human rights mechanism have not successfully ensured the adoption of human rights approach in the ASEAN pandemic response. Next.
Opening dash PowerPoint.
So these are like some of the key questions, key response that we received from the respondent. They highlight that it's the first time that AICHR made a joint statement, but also they want to see what are the follow-up, and they really expect that other ASEAN human rights mechanism acting on COVID-19. Next. Yes. So for other panelists, would be good if you can mute yourself while you're not talking, because some are hearing background noise. Thank you so much. And the third questions that we asked in the survey is, have ASEAN leaders successfully protected the right of people during the pandemic? 80% say that they disagree with the statement, which means that ASEAN leaders have not successfully protected the right of people during the pandemic. Next. And some of the comments say that the mechanism doesn't work, and then the ASEAN non-interference principle really hurting the ASEAN ability to act swiftly on the pandemic. Next. And we also asked the respondent what are the rights that they perceive to be most deteriorated during the pandemic, and these are the responses. Out of 12 rights that we provided, so they see freedom of expressions and freedom of assembly associations as rights that are severely deteriorating. 84% of the respondents say that freedom of expressions situation are getting worse, and also 80% say that freedom of assembly association are getting worse in the country during the pandemic. Next. And then they also perceive that almost 90% of human rights defender situations are severely deteriorating, and 80% of migrant and refugee rights are also getting backslided. Next. We also see that the indigenous people's rights that have not been really discussed in the forefront of the ASEAN processes are severely deteriorating, with almost 90% perceive perception of the survey respondent. Next. Aside from that, we also do qualitative media documentation and found the 3 trends on how COVID-19 impact the human rights, which will be further addressed by the other CSO speakers. First trend is the securitization and strengthening civic space. Second, as resonate with the respond violation of the freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. And third is the surveillance and violation of the rights to privacy. Next. And this is some of the laws that has been instituted by the countries to address the pandemic for your informations. And then next. So aside from the responses, we also want to know the benchmark on how other regional mechanism responses to the COVID-19. And then we use the example of AICHR, or the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the African Union Commission on Human Rights, the EU Council, and then AICHR. So to date, AICHR, the Inter-American, have released 25 statements from February until now, and African Union have released 16 statements. The European Union have received have released 13 statements, while ASEAN only released 1 statement, ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. So next. And the issues that has been covered by this statement are various. For example, the Inter-American even addressed the rights of LGBTIQ person and displaced person, indigenous peoples, while in the ASEAN statement, the ASEAN Human Rights Declarations are being used as a benchmark, which sometimes also excluding the rights of marginalized communities. Next. And in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, they even establish resolutions or guidelines. There are numbers of guidelines for the governments to address the situations by including human rights principles, but these have not been done by ASEAN and African Union, because Europe is already issuing the guidelines. And then lastly, in terms of the establishment of a mechanism, task force, the Inter-American Commissions has been very advanced in doing that that, they created like a rapid mechanism to receive complaint, and until now they have received more than 100 complaints during the pandemics and have addressed it accordingly. So next, so the recommendations can be definitely be highlighted further by the CSO colleagues that will talk. This is just information for you that actually there are a lot of expectations from the ASEAN people to the ASEAN leaders and human rights mechanism, and we really hope that despite of our limitations, we can at least look at inspirations from other regional mechanism on how we can address the situation in a more effective manner to protect the situations of human rights that we see more deteriorating during the current pandemic. So with that, I would like to end my presentations and give the floor back to Joel. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And indeed, we are still, we are still in terms of ASEAN's response to the pandemic, that it still very much is the old normal to the ASEAN, and it has barely scratched the surface in terms of responding and effectively providing solutions to the public health situation throughout the region. Thank you so much. We can talk about it further in our public forum, as well as we would like to hear the response of our MPs and our ASEAN representatives. Now, I would like to give the floor to Sopheap Chak from Cambodia Center on Human Rights. The floor is yours, Sopheap. You have 5 minutes. Yes, please.
Yes, good morning.
Thank you. Can you please try to reduce it to 5 minutes?
Sure, I try. And first of all, good morning, everyone. I'm Sopheap from Cambodian Center for Human Rights. And it is interesting to see the presentation earlier. And indeed, Cambodia is not far from, different. I mean, it's there in the regional context. So, indeed, when we look at the civic space in Cambodia, we have been experienced the new phenomena with, when I say new phenomena, it does not mean that we just exposed to the human rights challenges. It has been the struggle for years, but in this past few years, we face a new phenomena in which a number of key democratic actors have been experience the crackdown all in one. I mean, at the same time and in a mass scale. So if we look at the member parliamentarians, they all have been attacked. I mean, mainly the opposition parties. So in the latest election, you may have followed already that the opposition member and its party have been dissolved and removed from their position, and that is the MP. But also for the media, they also experience attack using the taxation regulation. So and a few independent media have been facing the crackdown, including the shutdown of the office by themselves, by theory, but in reality it was the force, because they experienced the restriction by the taxation. So it have affect the press freedom in Cambodia, where in the past we have been proudly say that, you know, although we experience the restricted press freedom, but compared in the region, we are in a better off. And then thirdly, the union and CSO, especially the human rights organization, even CCSO, we have experienced the threat of close down, and fortunately we still survive, and I could take part today's discussion. But in short, what I want to highlight is that in this past few years, the civic space in Cambodia have been not only shrinking but closing. And this leaves us in a very difficult situation where no one can represent each other or help each other. Like if we want to run to MP, there's no more MP that we can rely on, the MP who can question the government, question the ruling party. And if we're looking at the union who want to run to media or human rights organization, we also face a threat. So that is the difficulty. But whether during the COVID we are better off, no. The situation have been even problematic because of the context of the COVID, with the when it comes to the freedom of expression. Similar to Forum Asia presentation earlier, we can see that the freedom of expression have been declining because of the fake news rhetoric, and we have documented over 40 arrests and charge of individuals. Freedom of assembly as well, because a lot of time, even now in Cambodia, we are in a better situation for COVID. Of course, we are still cautious with the new, with the second wave of the COVID outbreak, but the key is that a number of gathering and even in a small scale, you know, they have been experiencing the crackdown or restriction. And then the freedom of association, yeah, and then when it comes to freedom of association, it also difficult in the way that they often the group have been accused or labeled as associated to the opposition party or labeled as the you know, kind of rebel against the government. So that is very difficult, and of course, you know, overall the impact again community as a whole during the COVID is very large. But when it comes to human rights context, it poses even stricter, and we just hope that, you know, together with the regional network, we can do better in terms of solidarity. And I think the one last point I want to make is that before and even during COVID-19, we can see that the government within the ASEAN region have been quite collaborative, and they learn from each other. Like it comes to the emergency state of law, the imposition of the state of emergency, but also when it comes to the arrest or disappearance of activists in the region. That is very concerning, and I'm glad that we can come together and discuss way forward that we can be together as a human rights community, as the ASEAN citizen, that we can unite it to overcome the struggle. Thank you.
Thank you, Sopheap, for that brief but very informative, very enlightening sharing. And it's as if that, you know, it's the issues that you raised were something that we've heard even even before COVID-19 had happened, only that the situation had aggravated the spaces and the chance for people to claim their rights in such a crisis, in such a state of emergency. And what you said a while ago, we shall be talking about more about solidarity in the next phase of our town hall session. Thank you so much, Sopheap. We will now give the floor to Ryan Silverio, who is the regional coordinator of the ASEAN SOGIE Caucus. Ryan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Joel, and I wish to greet everyone a happy Pride Month. Firstly, it's important to note that even before COVID-19, the situation of LGBTIQ human rights in Southeast Asia has remained to be problematic. 5 countries continue to criminalize LGBTIQ persons. There have been several cases of persistent political attacks in both online and offline spaces. And then the absence of legal gender recognition is still a key barrier which hinders transgender and gender non-conforming persons from accessing social protection and other development and inclusion programs. Now, when COVID-19 has manifested our region, firstly, we have received several statements coming from LGBTIQ persons that they have suffered from serious social stigma, being blamed for being the cause of the crisis itself. that we are the perpetrators. Because of us, our identities, our expressions, then COVID-19 did manifest. And this, I think, has to be addressed both by governments and civil society, because this perpetuates social stigma. The biggest blow, I think, when it comes to LGBTIQ human rights is in the economic front. Now, there is a youth organization from Myanmar called Rainbow Alliance who did a rapid research involving youth aged 19 to 24 years old. All of them are of working age, and all of them were working prior to COVID-19. More than 50% of them, of those who have been surveyed by this group, lost their jobs. Those who retained their jobs reported that they experienced significant reduction in terms of income. And I think it's very important to highlight that when we say LGBTIQ persons, you are also talking about workers. Workers who need to earn a living to support their family, to support their studies, and especially for LGBTIQ persons who are kicked out from their families, they need to support their own selves. It's also important to point out that many LGBTIQ persons are in the informal economy, sex workers, those in small-scale businesses, contractual workers, etc. And sadly, we don't have much statistics to point out the extent of the blow of COVID on LGBTIQ in the informal sector, but we have received many cases and narratives detailing their individual experiences. All right. In Cambodia, our partner called Micro Rainbow has reported that LGBTIQ-run businesses were forced to close down. Those who have been receiving microcredit are at risk of defaulting. Now, another key issue that were raised by many LGBTIQ groups are in terms of gender-based violence. Gender-based violence manifested both within the private sphere in the context of homes, such as reported by Sayoni and LGBTIQ groups in a group in Singapore. When they surveyed 500 respondents, 1 in every 5 live in family environments that are hostile towards their SOGIE. And 2 in 5 struggle with social isolation and inability to access support mechanisms. 3 in every 5 face mental health issues such as anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. It's also important to point out that gender-based violence manifested in the hands of law enforcement officials. In the context of Philippines, there have been 2 viral cases. For example, one case in Central Luzon where those who have violated their the quarantine policies were asked to perform lewd acts. In Zamboanga City, there was a case of trans and gender non-conforming persons caught for violating the quarantine law, and the police did cut their hair short. In Malaysia, there were also reports of gender non-conforming persons who were asked by law enforcement officials in checkpoints to reveal their dating acts. Now,
sorry, Ryan, I'll give you 1 more minute. Sorry.
Sure. I think another important element to highlight is the shrinking space. LGBTIQ persons are also involved in relief programs, in assisting fellow colleagues who are facing crisis. Sadly, there hasn't been much solidarity that we experienced from different groups, and there's been little support coming from government. But it's also important to point out that despite acts of solidarity, LGBTIQ groups are stretching out available resources. LGBTIQ organizations may be visible in advocacy spaces, but unfortunately, many are underfunded. A report pointed out that 0.04% of total funding for international development efforts and assistance are appropriated towards LGBTIQ organizing globally. So this is an indicator of how poorly funded LGBTIQ groups, but sadly, we are also expected to watch over and support our colleagues in the movement. So maybe during the open forum, I can add a couple more issues raised in our research, and would like also to hear feedback coming from our colleagues in the government. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for sharing with us and giving us information on the situation of our brothers and sisters in the LGBTIQ community. And indeed, the lived experience that they are going through has highlighted that COVID-19 is not indeed a great leveler, but is indeed a great unleveler, because the impacts of COVID-19 varies from one group to another, from one individual to another. Thank you so much. And we shall indeed get more information from you in the next phase of this town hall session. Thank you. Our next speaker from the CSO is Tolhas Damanik from Agenda Disability Rights, who is the Disability Rights Advisor. Tolhas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joel. Hi, everyone. I'm Tolhas Damanik. I'm representing General Election Network for Disability. Yeah, I would like to start my presentation with saying that person with disability also really impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. It's an estimated 90 million person with disabilities, high population of person with disability in this region that all impacted by this COVID-19. The main problem caused the disruption of the life of person with disability is the fact that the containment measure policies that not really consulted with the person with disability community. So that's why somehow the containment measure also impacted their life in certain aspects like health, education, employment, social protection, also political participation. I'll give you the example like access to health facilities, which is not really accessible, that cause any person with disability then cannot have the health service, that don't have access. Access to information, because a lot of information now about COVID-19 we can get easily, but not easy for person with disability, since the information is not really accessible. For example, without any sign language interpreter, our friend with deaf cannot access the information. Also, our friend with blind also cannot access the information, the printed material information. In employment, since many person with disability now working on informal sectors, for example, measure blind who work as a measure, they also impacted by the situation. They cannot access, they cannot have the customers due to the self quarantine policies. In access to social protection, I think this is really the case, because as you know that majority of person with disability still live in poverty, and with the lack of valid of data, somehow the government, even though they have the, for example, social security scheme, social protection scheme, but it cannot reach person with disability. Speaking about how the pandemic also impacted the DPOs, majority of DPOs need to be at home, working from home, and doing their advocacy by online. So that's kind of a situation that really affecting the disability community. From this situation, I think our recommendation can be several, because actually, as you may aware that ASEAN already launched the new document called ASEAN Enabling Master Plan 2025, mainstreaming the right of person with disability. We really recommend that all containment measure should be consulted, communicated, and with the disability community and DPOs, disabled people organization, to make all policies, all strategy become more inclusive for person with disability. We also encourage the collaborations among all actors from the national level to local level to implement the policy or strategy from the regional or even national to cope with this COVID-19 pandemic. Communication of information, this is something that really important for us, for person with disability during this COVID-19 pandemic. And since we are also entering the new normal, I think people with disability also would understand how they can manage their life during this new normal and as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. We also encourage the use of the technology to ensure the accessibility of all environment. And also to use the technology for enhancing the economic life of person with disability. With the use of technology, we can solve the problem related to education and employment. We also encourage the coordination among all actors, including the human rights CSOs, National Human Rights Commission, media, to discuss and to work on the intersectionality of the disability right in this during COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Pat Tolhas, for providing us with quite an elaborate presentation on the situation of persons with disabilities and the situation of disability in light of COVID-19. And indeed, the new normal will either pose a great challenge to persons with disabilities, or either would facilitate a much better condition for them in the coming months. Thank you so much. We will have more questions hopefully to ask, and we will wait for the response from our members of parliament and our regional representative. Thank you so much, Pat. We will now proceed to Muhammad Shafi, who is the General Secretary of ASETUC. The floor is yours.
Enter. Tab. Gallery view left. Shift tab. Leave button to activate. Press space.
Mohammed.
Shift tab. More meeting control. Shift tab. Share screen. Shift tab. Question and answer. Shift tab. Shift tab. Video settings. Shift tab. Stop my video.
Is Mohammed here?
He is with us in the panelist list, but hello,
Hello.
Mohammed. Let me just try to unmute his microphone.
Okay. Hello, Mohammed. Okay, while we wait for Mohammed, I think we can give the floor to Temba Lewis, who is the Secretary General of APPRN. Temba, you have some words for us for this session?
Hello.
Yes.
Good morning. Sorry, I was having a little bit of difficulty unmuting my microphone. For those of you who are not familiar with the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network, and I believe there are probably a good number of you on the call that are, the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network is an organization of members across Asia and the Pacific. We have about 440 members at this point, all working around the advocacy for protection of refugees and other people in similar circumstances. We focus heavily, of course, our membership and our secretariat based here in Bangkok on advocacy with ASEAN. And we have had a number of concerning developments over the course of the last months with COVID. The problematics that we see around refugee and asylum issues in the region did not begin of course, with the COVID pandemic, but have certainly been accentuated. They've become much clearer, but also much more challenging to advocate around. Notably, we have seen problematics around the fundamental right to seek asylum. This is very concerning for many of us. This stems initially from the travel restrictions and closure of border that we saw across the region with the advent of COVID, essentially removing access to people who are trying to pursue that right. There have been very, very few, if any, allowances made in those travel restrictions and border closures for people who need to seek asylum to circumvent the overarching restriction and to be allowed access. As a result, we've seen a rise in the number of boat movements in the Andaman Sea and across the ASEAN region for Rohingya. We've seen an increasing blockage of access to disembarkation of those boats. This is a violation of international customary law. However, without
internet baru mati lagi yang.
Sorry? I don't know if this was a question for me. Please, if it is, feel free to interrupt me. Basically, I will otherwise continue. The number of boats that we've seen leaving Myanmar, for example, has been on the rise. We do expect that this number may drop in the coming months, but we have seen an alarming response from ASEAN states to those boats. We've seen numerous instances of boats being pushed back out to sea, sometimes with hundreds of people aboard in very desperate circumstances. And as a result, those boats have been left adrift. We've found reports of bodies in the water. We've heard reports of very high numbers of people drowning or starving to death, or dying of dehydration at sea. And this is very, very concerning. We are also concerned about the rise in xenophobic attitudes that we've begun to see in the region, and the vilification, as mentioned earlier in this call, the vilification of minority groups around discussions of COVID-19. In Malaysia in particular, we've seen a very severe rise in xenophobic rhetoric. Perhaps even more alarming is the lack of substantive response from the Malaysian government to that rhetoric, and also neighboring states in ASEAN as a whole. We should not underestimate the dangers that this poses, not only to refugees and other migrants, but to minority populations within ASEAN states. We need to remember that these are ASEAN citizens, ASEAN people that are being discriminated against by ASEAN states. I believe that we can all work across borders to advocate to ensure that actions are taken swiftly, substantively, and with a good amount of fortitude to counter the narratives that are so insidiously undermining respect for minorities in the region. We've also seen, of course, some positive examples of response. We've seen ASEAN states allowing for refugees and others to approach health authorities in some instances, even without documentation, to ensure that COVID testing is done. We've seen other examples where that's not necessarily been the case, but again, to draw attention to Malaysia, we have seen positive examples in Malaysia. We've seen positive examples in Thailand. So I would note also that there are some bright lights here. but I think that our task is clear, and that is to ensure that not only for other minority populations, but also for refugees and asylum seekers who are a cross-section of any population and include intersectionally include all the other minorities, that fundamental protections are ensured, that they are supported in law, that the restrictions that we're seeing in place now are not formalized through the COVID pandemic into the future, and that the space for civil society organizations is not significantly shrunken. We see a lot of concern around expression of freedom of expression and freedom of assembly at the moment, but fundamentally, from my perspective at APPRN, there's one other very specific voice that we need to include, and that's the voice of refugees and asylum seekers themselves. I find myself often in gatherings such as this, presenting the issues that face those populations, but it's very, very important that we hear moving forward through a very inclusive approach, the voices of those populations that are being affected by the restrictions that we're seeing now. And with that, I would like to thank all of you for being on this call, for listening to the challenges that are being raised by each of the speakers today. And I will grant the rest of my time to the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Demba. And what you mentioned to us really highlights, it really amplifies the reality that COVID-19 had exposed the, the glaring gaps between non-citizens and citizens, and even between the minority and the majority populations in our countries. And it's indeed an unfortunate situation, and it's something that has been going on up until we speak. And what you said, that it requires a lot of changes, of reform, and of the need to highlight and of the need to address these issues immediately and urgently. We shall, again, as you said, we shall be discussing further in the next part of our forum. But then we will give now a chance to our MPs and our regional representatives to react to the presentations provided by representatives of CSOs. I would be giving 5 to 7 minutes to give their reactions each. So may I start with Charles Santiago from Malaysia to give his piece about what has been presented earlier. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Joel. Can you hear me? Hi, Joel. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Well, let me just begin by sharing a couple of ideas that came up as I was listening to these representations or the views of the civil society groups that we have early on. I must say that the first point I would like to make is that the presentation by Rachel in terms of the freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association is a pathetic description of the state of play in Southeast Asia. In fact, when you look at the numbers, the people of ASEAN themselves are saying that they are not happy with the way in which the leaders of ASEAN are conducting their affairs, especially in relation to human rights, good governance, and rule of law. When you have 75% of people saying that they are upset that the ASEAN governments are not following the ASEAN human rights mechanism in the ASEAN during the pandemic period, in the last 1-2 months, that tells you that ASEAN is not accountable to its own charter. The ASEAN charter clearly tells you that the human rights, rule of law, and good governance is something that has to be embraced by all of our governments. But clearly, this is not the case. The numbers are staggering. 80% said that ASEAN leaders have not successfully protected human rights in the region in the last 2 months, especially in the pandemic period. These are ordinary people. These are people who are actually members of civil society, or could be ordinary citizens, whose perception of ASEAN is basically that ASEAN is a rich man's club, is good for business and investments. But when it comes to human rights, when it comes to rule of law, when it comes to good governance, ASEAN's voice is completely muted. So the first point I would like to make, and is basically essentially saying that people in ASEAN have no faith that the ASEAN governments are interested and in promoting human rights in the region in good times or even in bad times. In this case, it's bad times. I think number two, the situation of human rights has exacerbated or further deepened, or the violations of human rights has been exacerbated or further deepened during this period, where governments have taken advantage of the pandemic in order to further suppress their people, violate human rights, or introduce new emergency laws in order to keep their positions of power, and also in the process killing away, destroying dissent. I think I would like to take a leaf from Sophia's presentation, where she said that members of parliament in the case of Cambodia, she's unable to go to complain to them or even raise issues with them about the human rights, because there is no member of parliament who wants to listen to them, because the opposition, the CNRP, has been decimated by the present government. Decimated not in a fair electoral process, but the rules have been organized in such a way that they were not able to even participate in the elections. In fact, they were banned. The leader of the party itself was banned from participating in the elections. Now, I think I met a senior leader of CNRP some time ago who was actually literally butchered by the security forces in Parliament compound 2 years ago, where he was beaten up so badly. He was beaten up so badly that they had to take him to Singapore to reconfigure his face. And till today, he's suffering from a variety of illness as a result of the attack from the security forces aligned to the president of Cambodia, or Prime Minister of Cambodia. Until today, he suffers from it. The last point I would like to make is the issue of refugees and asylum seekers, a presentation made by Themba Lewis. Now, this is actually, in my view, totally shameful. ASEAN talks about a caring and a sharing society. You can see it in all of its documents. You can see it in all of its press statements. And I'm sure come Sunday or Saturday, they will say the same thing, that we are a caring society, that we are a caring society, we are a society that reaches out. Nobody should be left behind in ASEAN. But clearly, when it comes to the Rohingyas, especially the refugees who are now in our midst, near our borders, in our seas, we do not have any compassion to bring them on board, provide them whatever support that they need. I think this is really, really shameful. And given that, and this is in violation of international law, where we have something called the refoulement, whereby governments have a responsibility. The Malaysian government, the Indonesian government have a responsibility to protect these refugees, because when they go back, they are going to be attacked by their own governments. Though they are going to be put in jail for all you know. So basically, our governments, regardless of whether they are in ASEAN or the same region, they should protect the refugees at this time. And that is something is part of international law that requires governments to protect people who are running away from tyranny, from violations of human, mass murder that took place, atrocities against them in the last 2-3 years, and it continues to happen. So ASEAN really has failed to live up to its expectations of a sharing society or a caring society. And I think, one of the calls I would like to make, and I hope there is a representative of government in this discussion. I think one of the things that we have to request our governments to make a decision this coming Sunday at their meeting, the heads of government meeting, is to call upon the Myanmar government and ASEAN to put more pressure on the Myanmar government to give citizenship rights to the Rohingyas. That is at the heart of the problem. People who are denied state, they are all stateless people because they do not have any documents and so on and so forth. Therefore, they should be given citizenship as the first basis in trying to resolve the problem of in Rakhine State. So I think one can go on and on, but I think what we see is a sad reflection. It's really a sad reflection after all these years of having the ASEAN heads of government meeting, and these reports are not new. Forum Asia, ASEAN parliamentarians for human rights, and so on and so forth have raised this almost on a yearly basis with our governments. But clearly, there is no traction with government because governments don't care. Human rights is just an appendix. It is not a priority for ASEAN. It is not a priority for our leaders, partly because in their own countries, they are making the lives of their own people miserable with all the emergency laws, all the violations of human rights. So you cannot expect despots who are managing their own countries, running their own countries, to come to an ASEAN level and say, we are going to liberate ASEAN, we're going to be a different ASEAN, we're going to be a caring ASEAN, or even an ASEAN that cares for everybody. And therefore, I think the people of ASEAN really have to wake up and put pressure on their governments at different levels in order to push for changes at the ASEAN level on the variety of issues that we have talked about, though, on human rights, on good governance, on the rule of law. And in the case of the Rohingyas, we really have to be compassionate, though. We really have to open our countries. We really have to embrace them because these are people that are going to die in the seas. And in fact, I think we have to learn from the experience of the Aceh, the 3 Aceh fishermen who actually came out to protect and help the ship, I think, which had about 300 people in it, which was broken, and they helped the Rohingya refugees. I think the government of Indonesia can learn from Aceh, the fishermen of Aceh. The government of Malaysia can learn from the fishermen of Aceh that all you need is compassion. They need a safe place. They need protection. And I think ASEAN can do it. And I hope on Saturday, they will come out with a resolution protecting the rights of refugees in the region. I think another failure is also the issue of migrant workers, the way migrant workers are being treated at this time during the pandemic. Somehow, the argument is it is the migrants who are spreading the virus among the population. Now, this is really wrong. This is actually quite false. And I think the governments have a responsibility to address some of these concerns. This is something that you find in Malaysia, for example. However, I want to say that in the case of,
we have 1 more minute, sir.
In the case of Singapore, where the government actually came out and told the public that we are together with the citizens of the country, are together with the migrants in the fight against the pandemic. That is the approach. We cannot put people we can't put citizens against the migrants in order as a way of trying to resolve a pandemic that we have in front of us. We need to work together as a family. We need to work together as a community of people to fight against the pandemic, to overcome the pandemic. We cannot choose to play politics with the pandemic, though. And we cannot violate, or we can't abuse migrants in the process. I think this is something that I think the ASEAN governments really have to think about at their meeting this coming Saturday. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. And just a few points that I got in what you mentioned about maybe ways forward is to really build that critical consciousness amongst people and hopefully amongst champions in governments. And what you also mentioned about compassion, cooperation, and having a region that's caring yet critical in terms of the issues that the people are facing, especially those who are the most vulnerable and at the margins of our of our region of Southeast Asia. Thank you so much. The Q&A, the questions also can be directed to our members of parliament and our regional representatives. So please keep them coming, and we shall be responding to them, addressing them after everyone has given their response. May I now give the floor to Sarah Jane Elago from the Philippines. Magandang umaga. The floor is yours.
Magandang araw, Joel. First and foremost, I would like to express our solidarity to all in pursuit of promotion and protection of human rights in these difficult times. We have heard from our CSO representatives and speakers how the people are already raising their voices and sounding the alarm. But instead of the governments of the ASEAN member states sincerely addressing all their needs and their demands, they have faced vilification and silencing of dissent and criticism. So I hope that this space, would be a space not only of sharing our struggles, but sharing our hope and determined commitment to protect and promote human rights. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed major weaknesses and inequalities in our governance systems. The region failed to protect those in the most vulnerable situations, in particular, its migrant workers and refugees. And it was used by some leaders to justify widespread restrictions on fundamental freedoms and scapegoating marginalized groups. So far, the ASEAN has ignored the human rights dimension of the crisis. Human rights that must be at the core, at the center of addressing a public health emergency. So at this week's 36th ASEAN Summit, we urge our fellow parliamentarians in the ASEAN and all the leaders to ensure that the response of the region to the COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath places human rights at its core. And as we emerge from this crisis, we, lawmakers and civil society organizations, need to collaborate even closer so that we become a creative initiative force to build back better, more just and sustainable societies, to ensure that our leaders learn the lessons of the crisis, make them accountable, and to guard against further encroachment on democracies and fundamental freedoms. It is critical for our governments to uphold the very basic principle of them having the primary responsibility to protect the people and ensure well-being and safety of its citizens amid the COVID-19 public health emergency. Thus, governments must take promptly needed response to the current COVID-19 crisis. It is also considered that our governments are the principal duty bearers within the international human rights framework. This responsibility comes with the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. On restrictions on your civic space, the governments, we have seen how governments in the ASEAN region have used measures initially intended to contain the spread of the coronavirus to instead implement the sweeping free speech restrictions under the pretext of combating the spread of false information and maintaining public order. Fake news has become the new excuse to arbitrarily arrest individuals. For instance, in Malaysia, hundreds of social media users are being investigated for disseminating supposed fake news. The same is the case in the Philippines, in which vocal citizens who are airing their grievances and sentiments on the public health response are being investigated as well. And while governments have the responsibility to counter all these false information, misinformation, we should never ever resort to criminal prosecution or heavy censorship. Instead, authorities and us lawmakers have a role to play in proactively disclosing information relating to COVID-19 to battle and effectively combat fear with facts and protect the free flow of information. We have also witnessed how authorities have used restrictions, disguised as public health measures to continue to eliminate political opposition, as have shared by our representative from Cambodia, that 12 supporters or members of the opposition from the CNRP have been arrested since the outbreak began. In the Philippines, our former colleague, Congressman Ariel Casilao, member of the opposition, was detained and charged for distributing aid during the lockdown. This crackdown on vocal critics of the center and the political opposition is unfortunately nothing new. Restrictions of free speech and political opponents were already increasing in the region, but the pandemic became a new tool for authoritarian regimes to further assert their powers and restrict civic space. So to combat such restrictive legislations or public health measures that are prone to misuse and abuse, we as lawmakers and also as part of the ASEAN Parliamentary for Human Rights need to work in greater synergies with CSOs, people's organizations, in our case as youth representation, a youth organization based in communities, in schools, and young public servants to stand up against such abuses and violation of human rights. On gender, COVID-19 is deepening pre-existing inequalities and has had a disproportionate impact on women. And so we must continue to call for uninterrupted flow of essential services, especially for women, and the protection of reproductive and sexual health and rights. Compounded economic impacts are felt especially by women and girls who are generally earning less, saving less, and holding insecure jobs or living close to poverty. Unpaid care work has increased, with children out of school, heightened care needs of older persons, and overwhelmed health services. Now, with restricted movement and social isolation measures, gender-based violence is increasing exponentially. Health services mostly needed by women were deprioritized, including access to abortion, birth control, and maternal care. However, in the case, for instance, in the Philippines, we have manifested our strong opposition to budget cuts in healthcare and also in education, which is greatly affected too by the COVID-19 crisis. So to start, we must also put in the agenda as our call in the 36th Summit of the ASEAN that leaders should ensure women's equal representation in all COVID-19 response planning and decision making. And also as youth rep, we call on the inclusion, the guarantee of inclusion and participation of youth in all aspects of pandemic response and recovery plan. We must apply and never ever exclude the use of the people's lens in the design for the economic stimulus packages and social assistance program to achieve greater equality, opportunities, and social protection for all in the time of a public health emergency. Thank you, and that's all for the inputs of this youth representation.
Maraming salamat, Sarah, for your inputs, and what you mentioned is really telling of the test of leadership of ASEAN member states at the national and regional levels, and also a test of their sincerity and commitment to bring their people forward, not just from this public health crisis, but also taking them closer to their human rights and freedoms, and based on what is happening now, some nations, some states are actually failing to do that, both in the aspect of public health and in the protection of human rights. Maraming salamat. We will get back to you later during the public forum. Thank you so much, Sarah. We now move to our representatives at the regional level with our AICHR representative to Indonesia, Yuyun Wahyunigrum, to give her reaction to our CSOs and to our previous members of parliament who gave their reactions as well. Yuyun, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Joel. Thank you, everyone. Good morning. Thank you very much for having me here. And thank you for organizing this event. I think your work, advocacy, and activism are very important to make sure that ASEAN process of regionalism will be a people-centered and people-oriented region. So my task is to respond what has been presented. So I took a note of all presentation from Rachel, Tolhas, Ryan, Temba, as well as the Member of Parliament Charles Santiago and Sarah. Thank you very much for that. Do we need to wait for Muhammad Shafi to say something, or we can just go ahead? Joel?
Just go ahead. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So as you know, I think Rachel also mentioned that by May 1st, 2020, AICHR has released a statement in relation to human rights for ASEAN governments to include as one of the approach to the COVID-19. But we also noticed that there has been a shift in ASEAN in relation to respond to the COVID-19 from all nations approach into the whole nation approach to whole ASEAN community approach. How it is implemented, so we still do not know. That is why a summit is needed to check to what extent the whole ASEAN community approach is actually taken place. As part of AICHR, we have established the position in which this is the first in our history that human rights should be in the heart of the efforts. So we will see how it is implemented later on by doing study and by doing some of the research. So I also would like to speak on behalf of AICHR Indonesia, not AICHR as a region, but AICHR Indonesia. Our office has documented number of violence happened during the last 5 months. We will be able to hopefully release it very soon, because it's full of analytical aspect to it, so it takes some time. I didn't expect it to be this long, but we come up with the analysis of to what extent this COVID-19 impact to the enjoyment of human rights in the region. We have number of reports, media coverage, as well as press releases from different organizations, but the number is very unequal from one country to another. One country has a lot of reports because press freedom exists, but the other country has no report at all. But it doesn't mean it doesn't have any human rights violation in that country. So we take a note on that. So in terms of what Sopheap mentioned, I also received this kind of documentation, the shrinking of civic space, as well as the engagement of media, parliamentary member, union, human rights defenders, civil society. So I think our documentation also cover what Sopheap already mentioned. In terms of for person with disabilities, thank you very much, Tolhas. This is very very informative, and it's very useful for us to add more on issues in relation to a person with disabilities. We lack of the information in regard how COVID-19 impact the right of indigenous people so far. But I noticed that in the survey done by Forum Asia, it mentioned also about indigenous people. So I would be very happy to receive information in relation to that. We cover also the issue of migrant workers as well as refugees in our documentation. In my capacity of AICHR Indonesia, I have responded to a number of issues for particularly on the issue of refugees. We also send some of the letters to the authorities related to authorities on refugees, not only refugees from Southeast Asia, but also refugees from outside of Southeast Asia. So this is something that we can do internally using this platform. There are things that I would like to mention here. Now some of the ASEAN member states begin to easing out the restriction. So this is the opportunity for us, for civil society, especially to provide kind of inputs how this ASEAN recovery plan should be framed. When you talk about human rights, how human rights can be included there in the language that a government can understand. As a part of AICHR Indonesia, we also develop the approach how human rights can be included in the ASEAN recovery plan. It would be very important if you can come up with this kind of suggestion and send to respected ASEAN sectoral bodies, if you wish. Or as Charles mentioned earlier, you can also use the national channel sent to your government, and government will be the one to table it. But unfortunately, in ASEAN, not all people have access to their government at the national level. So those who have the access, please maximize it. So that's one thing that I would like to mention. I'm also waiting for how human rights, our inputs will be framed, and this will be included in the 36 ASEAN Summit or Chairman Statement this weekend. I heard there will be two kind of important document will be produced. First is the Chairman Statement as usual, and secondly on chair vision. So chair vision is something I think only in very specific session or specific moment that ASEAN will produce this chair vision. Sorry. Nevertheless, I have checked that Chairman Statement hardly talk about human rights in history. There are a number of human rights mentioned in here and there, referring to the certain situation, but not every single Chairman Statement will mention about human rights. So we will see how Chairman Statement this weekend will mention about human rights, but we have develop our own inputs to the Chairman Statement, and I hope it is going to be respected or included in the Chairman Statement. And last point I would like to mention here that last year AICHR has managed to recognize communication on human rights. So we receive complaints on human rights. It will be recognized by the ASEAN Secretariat, and Secretariat will be distributing these complaints to the respective countries. So I would like to take this opportunity to invite more and more civil society or everyone to submit complaints on human rights to AICHR. The email is aichr@asean.org. So we can receive more complaints, then we can be able to discuss it further on how to respond the issues, especially in this kind of extraordinary situation in COVID pandemic. So that's So far, my response, Joel, and thank you very much for all inputs and comments and critics.
Thank you, Mba, and thank you for sharing with us the challenges as well as the opportunities for ways forward, including what you mentioned about the ASEAN Recovery Plan, and hopefully in this week's chair's statement that that the ASEAN body, that the ASEAN chair would actually set a precedence centering on human rights as as a driving force for ASEAN in what everyone is calling now as the new normal, and hopefully we get that. But I think the work, we still have so much to do in the coming days and in the coming months, and hopefully we can achieve something for human rights and freedoms. And that's what you said a while ago about the complaint mechanism, that we can maximize it as well, and hope it won't be used against civil society and affected people. And we will be checking that in the coming months. Thank you, Mba. But before we go to our last regional representative from Vietnam, we would like, again, I think our friend from ASETUC has found his way to our webinar. Welcome.
Yeah, hello.
Mohammed, you are given 5 minutes to say your piece. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity. First of all, I would like to express my apology because Dr. Shafi'i, the General Secretary of ASETUC, cannot come and speak in this forum. So I'm the Executive Secretary of ASETUC, will replace him, and I will speak on behalf of him. So he sent me some of the points that he would like to explain in this forum. The first one is about the COVID-19. As you may know, that the COVID-19 in ASEAN is now emerging. Now they are coming to the second wave of this pandemic, and then it has created so many challenges and problems to ASEAN specifically. And World Bank released that for forecast for the economic for this year and next year, it will be below 2%, and then so many companies has been closed because of this, and yeah, so many things that this pandemic affecting to all of us. And ILO has reported that around 6.7% of working hours globally in the second quarter of 2020, equivalent to 195 million full-time workers, has been, especially 125 million coming from the Asia Pacific, disrupted by this pandemic. So many challenges can be seen, especially in the job losses, a social problem, job opportunity that becoming disrupted, skills, because we are now preparing for the fourth industrial revolution, but now it's the needs of the new skills is now becoming more important because of this pandemic, the working condition, and also the most importantly is the public health problem. And because of this problem, it has also created so many social problems, like the gender problem, the problem for the migrant workers, because for example now the workers from Indonesia that usually come to the Malaysia, to Singapore, to Thailand is now has been closed. Now they are jobless. Now they cannot work in the Indonesia because you know there are so many job losses currently in Indonesia. Yeah, and also for the precarious workers, they have been also affected. So we need to have a working community for ASEAN to normalize the economy and the social problem in ASEAN. Now, ASETUC, we have been established in 2009, and we have created and we have are the representative from the trade union, and we are fully support every emerging problem every year, and we we try to consolidate the responses from a trade union perspective in order to solve the problem accordingly. We in ASETUC have annual conferences called RTSD. It is ASEAN Regional Tripartite Social Dialogue Conference. We invited the government, invited the employers, the academician, and of course the trade union. And for this year, because we are coming into the problem of the COVID-19, we are raising the problem for the pandemic, and also what we are going to do in the next month. So in this RTSD, we specifically talking about the workers' condition and the working condition, especially during the pandemic. As you may know, also in the we heard the news that this is only the beginning for the COVID-19. There are the new second wave coming on, and probably we don't know. We cannot predict when the pandemic will over. So we now with this conference which will be held maybe in the next 2 months, we will discuss and consolidate the responses from the government, the employees, and then the employees, and then we giving it to the ASEAN Secretariat for the follow-up regarding what we can do to normalize this condition. ASEAN has a declaration on the Special ASEAN Summit on Coronavirus Disease 2019, which is really good. We have the guideline, and our job is, especially for trade union and CSO, is to do the work according to the declaration. And we need to, after this, not only talking about the pandemic, but also way forward for it, because we need to have a transition for a better ASEAN, and for the sake and for the aim for the better ASEAN in the future. I think that's all for me. Thank you very much. And again, very sorry for the technical problem.
Thank you so much, Farizan, and thank you for sharing with us the situation of workers in our region. And indeed, they are at the heart of the situation as well, amongst any other vulnerable populations in the region. Thank you so much. Okay, we shall proceed in a bit to the public forum, but I think we need to take a 2-minute break to just absorb everything, and then so that we can also consolidate the questions that we will be asking. I was told that our representative from Vietnam will have to just take note of the discussion to report to the AICHR, and would not be able to represent the AICHR through a comment or by responding to what has been presented much earlier. So I guess what our Vietnamese representative will be doing will be taking down notes, and will be sharing it with ASEAN, with the AICHR chair. So we shall commence the 2-minute break so that we can consolidate, and then we will get back to you all. You can have your temporary break for a moment, and they will be back in 2 minutes so that we can start our public forum. Thank you so much. Hello, we're back. It's 2 minutes, so that we can achieve as much as we can for the public forum. So apart from this Q&A session, let this public forum also be an opportunity for our participants, our civil society members, and our individual participants to help maybe initiate already a discussion on the agenda of ways forward for civil society, for a regional agenda, to address or to make sure that the work on human rights and freedoms in the time of COVID-19 and the new normal will not be set aside from our end and from the end from ASEAN side. So if you have any suggestions, if you want to say anything about what agenda should we be doing, and how can we strengthen the solidarity amongst civil society organizations, even those at the local and the grassroots level, if you can provide your insights about that, that would be great. This will be documented so that we can, once that we collaborate, once that we proceed with the next ways forward, that we can consider your insights, and we can strengthen our work at the regional and national levels. But first, we shall be raising the questions. We shall be asking the questions that were raised much earlier on our Q&A box. As I've said, you can post your questions on the Q&A box, and there have been a number of questions related to the Rohingya crisis, also to the ASEAN body in dealing with human rights issues. But first, I think we can first ask the question related to, but I guess this is a question for the Vietnam AICHR. I would just want to raise this and have it documented so that our friend from Vietnam can take note of this. Has the Vietnam AICHR representative tried to encourage the authorities to be more restrained in their anti-human rights repression, because the Vietnam authorities appear to have used the pandemic as a cover to intensify crackdowns? This includes attacks on independent media, activists, and bloggers, arresting at least 12 activists over the Dong Tam land grab, and bloggers who challenged the Vietnam authorities' official narrative on their control of the pandemic. So I guess this is directed to the Vietnam AICHR. So I hope this gets noted, and hopefully if someone can respond, that would be much better. But please take note of this concern that's been raised. Anyone that would want to respond to this question? Or to the, okay. Hello. All right, we have a question now. I think we can ask Yuyun to answer this. How does the ASEAN Charter apply? Okay. How does the ASEAN Charter? How can we use the ASEAN? How can we apply the ASEAN Charter in ensuring that human rights issues are addressed during and after the pandemic? Does the Charter have any written agreement, or does it deal with such complexities? In maybe what she's talking about here is during during these kinds of pandemics, during such regional emergencies, does it provide any mandate to ASEAN in making sure that human rights are protected and that people are given their freedom during these times of crisis? Yuyun?
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, ASEAN Charter can be used. ASEAN Charter is quite wide in terms of human rights. It's only mentioned about adherent to human rights, good governance, and democracy. But if you look further, ASEAN also come up with the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, which I've been using very much in my statement, in my intervention, so that this ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, despite the fact a lot of criticism about this document, is actually drafted, agreed, adopted by the ASEAN member state. So this is an advocacy tool for everyone to seek accountability to governments. In fact, some of the, for instance, like one country has no human rights in their constitution, but agreed on the rights written down in the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration. So that's also can be used as an advocacy tool. So, to what extent it can be used? Yes, it can be used. To what extent it is effective? We need to use it to be able to know whether it is effective. So far, we have not been maximizing the document. My observation, we have not been able to maximize the document. So we don't know whether it's effective or not. My background is civil society. Whenever I would like to do the advocacy to ASEAN member state, I always make a quote from the ASEAN Charter or the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, and usually it has been quite successful in terms of asking for a meeting, but not yet in terms of putting the commitment into practice yet. So it requires more efforts. Oh, may I also announce something? My op-ed just published by Jakarta Post this morning. So I think that's also that summarized some of the situation of human rights in the region, looking at the comparison between countries that impose state of emergency and countries that are not imposing state of emergency, and how these two different camps impact to human rights. So yeah, please check out my latest op-ed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ba. Maybe you can also share the link to the.
Can
Sorry.
I respond to that?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay. I think the ASEAN Charter, which went through a whole lengthy process of consultation, as well as discussions within civil society, as well as with the government and policy makers in the region, clearly has got a commitment to human rights. It has got a commitment not only to human rights, but good governance and rule of law. So ASEAN governments technically are accountable to human rights, and something that they have signed. All the 10 countries have signed on to it. The problem here is now that it is not taken seriously, and it is not mainstream in terms of policies of ASEAN, regulations of ASEAN, or even the statements that the ASEAN heads of government will put out. So I think what needs to happen now is that human rights mainstreaming has to take place. Civil society has raised this issue many times, but the heads of government are not listening. I think this is something that we have to keep putting pressure on our governments in order to get the human rights perspectives onto ASEAN's agenda. That's point number one. Point number two is that these documents that are being signed at the highest levels of ASEAN are not legally binding. So therefore, you can't take action against ASEAN. But I think even if it is not legally binding, but since there is a consensus in the region about human rights, including the government, I think the governments have some kind of an accountability process, to the people of ASEAN. And I think that has to be activated, that there must be some response to that from the ASEAN governments. They simply cannot keep ignoring that. The other issue that where I think lots of individual governments get away is the nature of the decision-making process in ASEAN. which is based on consensus. That means all 10 countries must agree on a particular issue before it is put forward for discussion or put, for some kind of a document or an agreement. Now, clearly, this does not work well because, and I think in my view, it is a bit opportunistic as well. When it comes to business or investments, the way the decisions are made are different. There is no consensus. In fact, every ASEAN country has got a score chart, in terms of how much they have fulfilled in terms of their trade agreements within ASEAN itself. And all of them have to do a reporting. All of them have to do some kind of an accountability process to the rest of the ASEAN community. So that same idea can be replicated for the issues of human rights, good governance, or even the SDG goals, where ASEAN itself provides its commitment or actually reports to us as citizens of this country on the successes implementing or embracing human rights, SDG goals, or other issues surrounding people in the region. I think this is important. But the last point I want to make is really quite important. This has got to do with ASEAN's relevance and ASEAN's presence in the region. Now, we have a pandemic, a huge one, and a pandemic that has led to a huge loss of jobs. A huge, millions of people will be laid off in the next months, and so on and so forth. In Malaysia, for example, according as of April, 720,000 jobs have been lost, and the numbers, can be go up as high as 2.4 million at the height of unemployment in this country. Malaysia has never seen something like this. But I do not see a discussion within ASEAN at the highest levels in terms of a cooperation or an economic stimulus package that ASEAN itself puts forward in order to help the poorer countries of ASEAN, or how ASEAN itself can promote an urgent trade within itself in order to help each other as we go forward in trying to fight and overcome the epidemic. So, for example, Vietnam, the host, is a big producer of rice together with Thailand. Many parts of the region might have problems with rice, for example, or vegetables, or some kind of food, or some kind of services. This is where ASEAN cooperation is quite important, so that ASEAN, together as a region, can help its people and stay relevant and present to its people. I think this is something that I think we need to have put forward as part of our discussion with the ASEAN community. I'll stop at this.
Thank you. Anyone else? I think Rachel wants to also respond to the question.
Yes, thank you so much, Joel. So I can't agree more with what Charles has been put forward. I think it's very important for ASEAN mechanism as a whole to really prove its relevance, because the survey, the rapid assessment that we did together with SHAPE and SAPA really highlighted how people's perceptions on ASEAN has been declining for the inability to address the pandemic. And it's also very important to follow up on what Yuyun has mentioned earlier on the recovery plan, a post-pandemic recovery plan. Currently, the economic post-pandemic recovery plan is on the table to be discussed. However, we see that COVID-19 are being used as reasons on why ASEAN leaders have not included ASEAN CSOs in the table. So it is really important to make sure that there are participation and meaningful engagement of the civil society organizations in the table. And we are actually really surprised that the ASEAN leaders do not include interface meeting between CSOs and ASEAN leaders in the current summit, while last year we actually have that mechanism. So we really hope that there are some kind of mechanism of participation as in ASEAN, we agreed that people-centered are become one of the key principles in making decisions. And then also, secondly, I would like to really encourage ASEAN human rights mechanism, in this case AICHR, to look at the regional mechanism as inspirations. I think what AICHR, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, have done with creating a rapid integrated mechanism to get the complaint, as well as issuing guidelines and policy recommendations to the government, is really powerful. And this is the right time to do that. And hopefully, civil society organizations can be participated in the creation of those guidelines as well. So that's actually from my side, Joel. We really are very concerned about the current situations, and we think that this is already a crisis in the making. Especially because, as Yuyun said, there are 4 ASEAN member states that have instituted emergency law to address COVID-19, and yet we don't know until when they will utilize that law to legitimize the use of military and police forces. This should not be our new normal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And I think what our panelists have raised really sheds light on not just the shrinking of space for human rights, but I think a shattering of spaces and opportunities, and what we're seeing here as continued militarization of the response, not just during COVID-19, and what we're seeing, it will drag on up to the new normal, as they say, is something very worrying. It's something that is concerning, gravely concerning everyone's, not just the civil society organizations, but also people at the margins and those at the vulnerable populations as well. And I think the questions here that are being raised are connected to that in light of this regional situation of extreme securitization of COVID-19 and of the new normal. There's also that militarization of the new normal. What and still with the ASEAN principles of non-intervention, of sovereignty, and all other principles that are in place in the region, how can we still put pressure on countries at the national level and even at the regional level? How can we still put pressure on countries that continue to deny the rights of, especially of refugees, of minority populations, of indigenous peoples? What could be that? What could be that channel? What could be that opportunity still, now that we are already placed in a position where where movement is so much restricted, that our freedoms are already being purged in this situation of militarization? How can we still make countries and even ASEAN accountable to human rights and fundamental freedoms? Can anyone respond to this question? And this is also related to the issues that's been raised about the Rohingya crisis and about state violence happening at the same time as the pandemic, at the peak of the pandemic, specifically in Burma and Myanmar. Can we please have some responses?
Joel, can I ask for clarification?
Yes.
Well, because I saw a lot of questions, but I cannot read one by one. So this kind of hindrance of sovereignty, non-interference principle, and others, that's lead to the role of civil society or
No.
The member state?
So the member states. So it's impeding any kind of opportunity to actually make ASEAN and its member states more accountable and you know, finding solutions to these problems is also making it's also quite bleak at the moment. And what are the ways to make and this is also related to how we can strategize for the agenda in the coming months. How can we make ASEAN and the member states more accountable now that we are in the situation of militarization and extreme securitization?
I think it would be helpful not to put generalization of this region in terms of militarization. Yes, there is militarization and securitization has been taken as an approach in dealing with COVID-19. We observe that, we see that, but it is not all. No? In my experience, some issues can be discussed in the official meeting. Whether or not it lead to certain decision, that's a different issue. But it means number of non-interference principle has been broken down or broken in number of meeting. It can be done in the formal meeting, informal meeting, a retreat, but unfortunately something the way it has been reported to public is different. So in my experience so far in AICHR, non-interference principle is not that strict as many scholars want us to think. It can be done in many ways. And also in my case, for instance, I can use this platform to approach the Indonesian authorities in relation to many issues. So that also can be one of the alternative for advocacy. It has been a different way of looking at this kind of non-interference principle or sovereignty, or what many scholars has been said as the hindrance of human rights. Sometimes things can be done. It is not like black and white. I mean, that's so I'm sure there always a chance or loophole or channel in which civil society can always raise the concerns through the national channel or regional channel. In the situation like this, to respond to the summit, if you want to have something written down, or if you want our concerns taken into account in the government's statement, we have to work 2 or 3 months before the situation. So we are in very extraordinary situation because the decision of having this summit is very, very short. So both government and civil society perhaps lack of preparation to do that. But in my case, before when we know the dates, we work before the dates, and that because in AICHR we have to discuss all 10 countries we have to come up with an agreement. So we work far before the dates of the summit or the date of the ASEAN ministerial meeting to make sure that our concern, our intention or words to be included in the official document, because when certain words included in the official document, that become advocacy tool for everyone, for us in AICHR and also for civil society in general.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to respond to that? So it's a question that's actually a combination of a lot of questions from the chat box. Can I then give the floor to PT Lim? I think he would want to add about the rights of disability community during COVID-19, and perhaps he would want to also share some of his insights to the questions. PT?
Thank you very much, Joel, and I really appreciate this opportunity to be part of this panel. And between my dear colleague Tohas and myself, between Agenda and ADF, we are trying our very best to champion and advocate for the rights of the disability community during the COVID-19 pandemic, and more so perhaps in the post-COVID-19 era. I feel that there's a very strong urge for us to look at the ASEAN Enabling Master Plan 2025, which was already accepted and approved by the ASEAN Summit in November 2018 in Singapore. And if you remember, the 76 action points there actually gives a very good platform for a multi-stakeholder approach on how the rights of the disability community can be looked at within ASEAN. And for the last 1.5 years, we've been championing very hard to get greater public awareness and formulate some action plans to bring CSOs and OPDs into the foray of getting the public to have a better understanding of what the Enabling Master Plan is all about. And I think some of the key points of the Enabling Master Plan actually talks a great deal about inclusive design, inclusive communication, as my dear friend Toas is talking about just now, and the fact that we should not leave anyone behind, because the disability community actually forms a very major part of what the ASEAN community is all about. And especially, I think, if you, during the present COVID-19 pandemic situation, when we look at the emergency health measures, I think we need to make sure that it is inclusive and that the person with disability, the disability community, will not be left out of whatever procedures and measures that are in place to make sure that we minimize and even avoid the dangers that have been presented by this pandemic. So again, I want to re-emphasize very clearly that the ASEAN community can actually look at the ASEAN Enabling Master Plan 2025 as the basis of how we can push forward, because it is already a document that's been accepted by the ASEAN Summit, and I think we can use it to push it forward, push our agenda forward, and make sure that all the governments within ASEAN can be reminded of the obligations that they have put in place when they accepted this master plan. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, PT, for sharing with us more information about, opportunities and on the rights of persons with disabilities in the time of COVID-19 and the new normal. Do we have any response? Okay, and I think this is, yes, Ryan?
Joel. Yep, thanks. I think to respond to the issues about what ASEAN can do, what else can be done, I think from our perspective within the LGBT community, we realize that ASEAN has not done anything. The UN independent expert on SOGIE since March this year has conducted several town hall meetings and consultations and have been requesting for communications from LGBT groups globally, but we haven't seen that in the context of ASEAN. And based on Rachel's presentation earlier, you can see that LGBT issues haven't fared across the different sectors that ASEAN has dealt with. Now, the independent expert on SOGIE prepared a framework on how to ensure LGBTIQ inclusion in COVID programming, and he coined the term ASPIRE. It's kind of long, but I'd like to highlight a few. Number one, acknowledge that LGBT persons are everywhere. Support the work of LGBTIQ CSOs and human rights defenders. And I think this is very important because at the end of the day, we cannot get money from ASEAN to do relief work and social protection programs. We have to rely on our own community. So it's more of an internal solidarity mechanisms are actually working at this time. And then another thing to highlight in that ASPIRE framework is ensure representation of LGBT groups and marginalized sectors in the process of designing, implementation, and evaluation of COVID measures. Another point that I want to highlight is that while we are conceptualizing the new normal, ASEAN is also in a sinister move to define and deepen the concept of ASEAN identity. And I think we have seen this in the statements of the Vietnamese chair that this year they're going to formalize the definition of ASEAN identity. Are we still going to allow this identity to be defined by values of non-interference, cohesion, unity, but excluding solidarity and ensuring inclusion of specifically of marginalized groups? So I think as civil society, we also have to seize that area of defining ASEAN identity.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I think you've taken the discussion to another level on how CSOs can actually be, in terms of ensuring that solidarity still remains and is very much strengthened in the region. I think what you mentioned about ASPAR and about ensuring representation, about assuring that there are spaces also for collaboration between and amongst civil society organizations and governments in this time of pandemic, and the new normal has to be ensured. And I think on top of that, there has to be ensured accountability of government, of policymakers, of enforcers as we enter the new phase of the post-COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you so much. And I think this also would be raising a lot of questions on what opportunities I think this is not just for the panelists. If anyone from the participants can also give their insights about this. What are the opportunities to further mainstream human rights in a meaningful way when specific structures of accountability are weak, or in some places are even absent, and where states loathe to implement that accountability? Again, the question is, what are the opportunities? What can be possible opportunities to mainstream human rights in a meaningful way when specific structures of accountability are weak or are not in place? And this is also something to think about if we, if we want to design asks for future collaboration among civil society organizations, and even with our well-meaning national and regional representatives here. Can someone? So the floor is yours, but for someone who would want to respond.
I could say something. I posed the question, so I'm not sure that I should be the person to answer it, but maybe I could start the thinking around it. Here in Bangkok at the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network, as we work to advocate with ASEAN and with the member states of ASEAN, especially in the context of rising levels of nationalism, xenophobia, isolationism, we need to find ways to ensure that the commitments made, as Charles mentioned earlier, and likely will be made again at the upcoming summit by ASEAN, are actually held to account. And I think that we've seen in much of the globe that accountability comes in terms of particular sanction. And that sanction could take the form of lack of access to certain trade, beneficial access to certain trade agreements, or in some cases, like the European Union, there's actually a legal accountability mechanism in place. We don't necessarily have that here in this region. But what are we missing? What are the things that we are not thinking of in terms of holding ASEAN and the member states of ASEAN to account in terms of those declarations, ensuring, for example, respect for the rights of minorities and displaced people, or ensuring, for example, that commitments to increasing livelihoods and other support systems are actually implemented. Some of my thinking comes around engaging more increasingly the role of CSOs, civil society, basing this building a movement towards these goals that can no longer be ignored by ASEAN. I do think economics comes into play, but those are very, very long-term. They tend to be very, very long-term projects. And while we can certainly begin them, the reason that I asked this question is to explore with the people on this call, whether panelists or members of the participants, what other avenues do we have? What relationships are we not thinking of? What's the role of enterprise? What's the role of labor? What's the role of unions? What's the role of localized advocacy groups and communities in this? And how can we help to support that in order to create an accountability to the commitments that ASEAN member states make around the rights of minorities and other people facing significant challenge in the region?
Okay, Tamba, so that, I think we would need to wrap up, but I think what we can do is maybe we can ask each of the panelists to give, based on I think what you said and the question that you raised, if I can give a minute or two for each panelist to give their final say based on the question that needs to be addressed. Rachel, can I start with you, please?
Yeah, sorry. I'm just trying to unmute my microphone. I think, thank you so much, Joel, for the opportunity. I think the closing statement would be meaningful civil society engagement is imperative, looking at the current shrinking civic space and restriction of freedom of expression and assembly association that we are at, using the name of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I also would like to encourage the solidarity building among our fellow civil society organizations and human rights defenders to looking at the ASEAN structure and mechanism, and do the work as the watchdog role to making sure that our leaders are accountable to human rights and democracy. So I think that's all from me. Hopefully we can continue the discussions to provide very specific recommendations and discourse building on how the post-pandemic will be look like in ASEAN mechanism with upholding human rights, of course.
Thank you.
Joel.
Thank you. Sophia, perhaps you have some recommendations for ways forward for civil society organizations. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, that's good. Yeah, I try to answer a few questions, but in short, thanks for the opportunity. I think that kind of dialogue would be useful, and if we keep going, because then we will have a more sense of solidarity and have a chance to explore what are our common challenges and how best we get out from it. But I think in this time of repressive environment and from Cambodian experience, I believe that maintaining our spirit, maintain our principle in our engagement, I think that's the way to go, regardless any restriction or like attack against us. I think there are less chance that the government can get our space. So maintain the principle in our advocacy, and I also see the opportunity during this dark side that I witnessed a growing synergy and collaboration among civil society partners, and that is something we should take or maximize that opportunity by exploring more joint advocacy, more joint work, and that can allow us to speak a stronger voice, and this is something that many Cambodian Cambodian CSO have been applying in the mid of crisis, and when a single NGO would be speaking up may face a clear threat. So joint advocacy, and I think I would end by encourage our partner to continue documenting the human rights violation, because documentation will allow us to be a more evidence-based advocacy, and from that we can use to publicize, to make public informed, but also as an evidence in our advocacy with national and international mechanisms such as UN, and try to be more flexible as well. I mean, there's time when we see that human rights situation get better, but there are times when we see it's down. So try to be flexible in ourselves. Don't create more tension amid the problem. So I would also draw attention to our member that, aside from looking at the external actor, we should also revisit our victim. The victim here, I refer to the fact that we need to also take care our mental health. I think that is very crucial, that a lot of time we pay attention to other, but we rarely take attention to our staff, to our community. So expand our work on the way that we can support beyond the advocacy, but a mental health support for our own, but also for the community. And I would like to thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Okuncharan, Sopheap. Thank you so much. Ryan?
Yes, Joel, I think we are facing we are in a liminal space where we have to constantly and critically reflect on the relevance of institutions, especially those that have not shown a good track record in promoting our rights and dignity. In the past few months, we have seen many local LGBTIQ organizations raising funds to support their respective constituents and communities. If there is something to be hopeful, I think it is in that area of civil society where acts of solidarity continue to persist with or without support of ASEAN and governments. So I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Pat Tolas?
Okay, I would like to take this opportunity to remind everyone of the intersectionality of the disability issues. Remember that disability rights is a human rights. With that, I really look for the collaboration between DPOs and CSOs in advocating for the human rights fulfillment and implementation in ASEAN. And also, I would like to seek also your support to strengthen the awareness raising of this community towards the right of person with disability. Thank you.
Yeah, our friend from Asetuk, Farizan.
Thank you. For the closing statement, I would like to raise the, as you and everyone may know, that ASEAN using the people-centered approach. So we know that the importance of the ASEAN is, the core of the ASEAN is for the people. So it is also important to engage with the workers and the trade union, because we will provide the views and the recommendation for the for better ASEAN.
Farizan?
Yeah, hello.
Yeah.
especially in the occupational safety and health, and also for the social protection. And to do the just transition in the future, for better ASEAN. I think that's all.
Thank you so much. We can proceed to Charles.
Thanks, Joel. I think the region, and in fact the global economy, is facing an unprecedented crisis, never seen before. And the crisis is not over till you have a situation whereby there is a vaccine. So this is going to be a long, prolonged pandemic, but a long crisis as well. So in a crisis, and part of a region, and when you're part of a region which has been around for almost 40, 50, 60 years, you need leadership. Leadership on how to come out of the crisis, how countries can support each other in the process of coming out of the crisis. And I think this is really quite important to show solidarity between countries, solidarity between different stakeholders in the region, for ASEAN to stay relevant to the people of the region. And as pointed out by our friends and colleagues earlier, that ASEAN can speak on workers' rights, can speak on food issues, food supply issues in the region, can help the region in all of these areas, including migrant rights as well. Today, refugees have problems. Migrants are being perceived as enemies. This is something that ASEAN can address. Refugees should be part of the ASEAN mix, part of the ASEAN big family, as well as migrants as friends and not as foe, not as enemies of the state, enemies of people, but friends of ASEAN. This is the time for that leadership. This is the time for that kind of compassion. And this is the time to protect human rights as well. Not to create more problems for people, not to violate people's rights as a way to stay in power. I think people are watching and people are getting tired and people are losing faith in ASEAN. So I think if ASEAN wants to redeem itself, then on Saturday, they have to make some very important decisions. One, increase solidarity between the regions in order to help each other as part of managing the crisis. That's number one. Number two, to provide support for refugees, especially the Rohingya refugees who are now in the Malaysian waters and also the Indonesian waters. And I said earlier that maybe the people of ASEAN can be the teachers of the leaders of ASEAN, as in the case of the fishermen in Aceh, who went out to help the refugees in the country in the seas. And third, to provide what you call a kind of advice to ASEAN countries on the way to manage migrant workers in the region. And I think this is where we can learn from Singapore, where Singapore has managed its relationship with migrant workers as part of a larger Singapore family in trying to overcome the pandemic, and not to turn migrant workers as enemies in a country like Malaysia, for example. I think this is something that's very good. And I think ASEAN also can learn from a country like Vietnam, which was able to manage the pandemic in a very successful way. The lockdown was very minimal as opposed to other countries. So there are a lot of things that we can learn from each other, from the people of the country, people of the region as well. So I think that has to be encouraged for ASEAN to be truly effective and truly be relevant to the people of ASEAN. With that, thank you very much, and thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Charles. Sarah?
Thank you, Joel. I believe that we can also put more pressure on our parliaments as part of the ASEAN Interparliamentary Assembly, or the AIPA, to reflect not only the immediate urgent need for a more comprehensive, effective, human rights-based approach that leave no one behind in the pandemic response, but also in moving forward, making sure that the rights and the aspirations of each of citizens of the ASEAN are protected and are very much not only listened to, but their needs addressed and acted upon. Solidarity is what we need the most now, and so uh, in all the life-saving interventions that our governments are leading now, we reiterate our call that all these measures must be carried out with strict adherence to human rights standards and in a way that is necessary, non-discriminatory, and proportionate to legitimate health goals. And I put an emphasis to health there because navigating around this uncharted territory of facing new pathogen is never and will never be an excuse, or it must neither be abused nor misused to target and discriminate particular groups, squash dissent, and justify repressive actions under the guise of fighting the virus. Maraming salamat po. Isang makabayan na pagkakaisa na para po sa lahat. At stay healthy, stay hopeful, stay committed to people's rights and welfare. Thank you, Joe.
Maraming salamat, Sarah. May we, Yuyun? Any parting words, please?
Okay, thank you very much. My last word will be that the COVID-19 is indeed a challenge for any institution, anyone, any country in the world. But it can also be seen as an opportunity to see how we can get out from this a problem better, stronger, and whatever the language, resilience. This is the words that has been running around in ASEAN level. So again, I would like to repeat that how to make sure that our collective experiences in dealing with challenges, new challenges in dealing with COVID-19 can frame, can shape the way we want the region will be. Of course, it require a lot of work to do. From my side, that's something that I would like to go about to define or redefine what the new normal is about for the region, putting human rights and democracy as a center of the new normal. As of now, we are now developing this kind of framework on how to put human rights to development into the way we see a new normal after COVID-19. Still very early stage, but I hope to be able to discuss if there is any opportunity in the future on how we want the new normal for ASEAN will be. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Yuyun. And as we end, I think as we speak, as we are conducting this town hall session, cases of infections and deaths are still rising, but at the same time, human rights violations in our communities are also spiking. What has happened in the past few months is proof that human rights is seemingly not considered as an essential good by our governments, and apparently it's being set aside, with a number of human rights defenders suffering, coming out as casualties to such states of emergencies. And I think what our panelists had mentioned here, that while there is hope, we still need to put pressure on our regional and national and even local governments to remain accountable to their work, to their mandate of protecting their people, their rights, and their freedoms. And what we also need to do, that amidst the lack of resources available for civil society, the shrinking, or rather the shattering of spaces for dissent and for freedom of assembly, that we have to make sure, and that we need to reaffirm the need for us to collaborate much further and to strengthen our spirit in the name of human rights and peace, especially those of the vulnerable and the marginalized. And definitely such discussions will not end here. In terms of the virtual, this virtual ASEAN community among civil society, the end has not yet ended. I would like to invite everyone to fill out the evaluation form, the poll that is being provided, so that we can also evaluate the impact of this forum, as well as I would like to now give the floor to Forum Asia, who will be presenting to us a video on the voices from the ground from different countries in Southeast Asia. Again, marami pong salamat, Kopun Kap, terima kasih, and I hope that everyone is safe and healthy and everyone stays in power. Keep safe. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joel, for a very amazing moderation of the town hall.